The Dead Space remake has me in a bind, and not the fun kind. For one thing, Dead Space Remake rules. This motive remake of the 2008 survival horror classic contains all the thrills, scares, and action that the original possessed, all while utilizing modern game development hardware to amplify the OG game's strengths. In fact, the dynamic lighting and the lack of load screens really immerse the player into this gore-soaked and suspenseful experience and really makes us all feel like we, alongside Isaac Clarke, i.e. the protagonist, are stranded on the derelict spaceship, the Ishimura, whilst there is an alien viral outbreak transforming the ship's denizens into multi-limbed monstrosities so grotesque they would even make Dorian Gray wonder if he's looking at a self-portrait, because Dead Space Remake is pretty awesome like that. But on the other hand, I'm more than a little cynical about this game. After all, Electronic Arts, Dead Space Remake's publisher, had previously treated this IP and Visceral Games, i.e. the original developer behind Dead Space, like absolute dog shit, especially by the time Dead Space 3 was released in 2013. See, despite how the series was critically acclaimed and how, back in the day, Dead Space 1 originally sold 1 million copies and Dead Space 2 sold 2 million in its first week alone, which are terrific feats for a new survival horror IP, it was not enough for Electronic Arts, and for Dead Space 3, the game was designed to be more of an action experience given how it had co-op. It, in theory, would appeal to a wider audience, thus why EA at the time said that the game needed to sell 5 million copies in order to keep the IP afloat. Per a CVG interview from 2012 featuring then EA Games Label's president Frank Dubois, in general, we are thinking about how we make Dead Space a more broadly appealing franchise, because ultimately, you need to get to audience sizes of around 5 million to really continue to invest in an IP like Dead Space. Anything less than that, and it becomes quite difficult financially given how expensive it is to make games and market them. End quote. Now, I'm not a businesswoman. My eyes automatically glaze over whenever reading a quarterly earnings report, and I don't even know what the word synergy means. But I do believe that I have common sense, and common sense tells me that EA's statement is outrageous here. As stated before, Dead Space 1 originally sold 1 million copies, and Dead Space 2 sold 2 million copies at launch, yet Dead Space 3 needed to sell 5 million units? Like, how the hell did EA come up with that number? Because let's be honest, the notion that Dead Space 3, which let me remind you is in the semi-niche genre of survival horror where any amount of millions of copies sold should be a marker of success, can outsell its predecessor by 3 million copies is wishful thinking that cannot logically exist on this astral plane. It's like me saying I need 100,000 YouTube subscribers a week after this video launches, even despite how, as of this recording, I'm sitting at a mere 411. It's not realistic thinking, though of course please do like and subscribe and all that shit. And while maybe the Dead Space IP really was that expensive, I have to wonder how smart EA was to invest in a property in such a way. Like, I wonder why they thought transforming it into a multimedia property that included games, comics, movies, and such was such a good idea. Because make no mistake, Dead Space is not an everyone can play type of game or property. It's a horror series where you saw off alien limbs in gory fashion. It doesn't have universal appeal, even though in a perfect world it should and it would. Well, it would be a better reality than this one at the very least. So yeah, Dead Space 3 needing to sell 5 million units was an outlandish desire on Electronic Arts' part. And out of the fact that, by design, Dead Space 3 alienated many members of its core survival horror audience by being a more co-op action-oriented experience and featured microtransactions that really gunked up the game's progression system, Dead Space 3 did not meet the unrealistic expectations of its publisher. Like the child of a perfectionist father, it was always doomed to fail. The game undersold, and thus the Dead Space IP was scrapped, and a few years later the franchise's developer in Visceral Games was closed down. In other words, the people that created this genius, awesome, and excellent IP were discarded, like so many EA-owned studios before it, because when it comes to axing developers, EA is a goddamn serial killer. The publisher just has a callous disregard for the video game medium's artistry and those who work in it. This fact has been weighing on my mind while playing the Dead Space remake. After all, EA is pretending like all of its past baggage and its past mishandling of the IP and those who worked on it is water under the bridge, even though the Dead Space remake's very existence is an insult to injury. It spits in the face of both the IP's history and those who developed it. And given that, I want to hate the Dead Space remake. I want to despise its very existence, but I honestly can't, because damn, this game is awesome. Like, it's it's a very faithful recreation of the original. Sure, there are some differences in gameplay balancing and side quests that feel inessential to the overall experience, but the game is still Dead Space to its very core. You know, a game that is awesome. Like, the setting in the Ishimura still has a great sense of character, the UI, menu system, and HUD are still second to none, the necromorphs are incredibly well designed monsters. To defeat those said monsters, you have to hack them apart at their limbs instead of with headshots, which remains a very inspired creative decision that gives the Dead Space IP a very unique identity. There's no microtransaction nonsense, the upgrade system is rewarding, the arsenal of weapons at Isaac's disposal are varied and useful, the minimal amount of ammo and health forces the player to get creative in how they proceed through the game's more dangerous environments, the zero gravity sections are terrific, though these sections do come with one flaw in how it's sometimes difficult to see where enemies are attacking you from, because, you know, you're literally taking it from all sides here. The puzzles are very crafty and require the player to think outside the box at times, and the game wears its Alien and Event Horizon influences on its sleeves, even though I'm gonna be honest, I really don't like Event Horizon. Not a fan. But still, Dead Space Remake is really good, and that's even before we broach the topic of its various additions and improvements, such as the stunning dynamic lighting and the contrast between light and dark areas. Like, the way the game works with shadows is stunning, to be honest. The lack of load screens really help further instill a sense of character in the Ishimura, as well as a very immersive horror atmosphere. And the fact that Isaac is more involved with the main story, though some folks might take umbrage with the fact that the once silent Isaac now talks, really makes the player feel more involved with the narrative. It's all really good, and while sure there might be some questions as to whether or not Dead Space really needed to be remade, because the original Dead Space still plays incredibly well for its 15-year-old age after all, the Dead Space remake is all still pretty awesome. It gives the player a good reason to replay a new incarnation of Dead Space, an incarnation that is a rollicking good time. And despite the IP's past baggage, I can't help but to commend the developer Motive for the work that they put into this game, because by itself, the game is excellent, and the studio, unlike its publisher, clearly had a love and a respect for the Dead Space IP, and thus Motive is worthy of all the praise that the game is receiving. They have earned it. However, that said praise should not extend to Electronic Arts. After all, EA does not deserve credit for resurrecting this IP when they are the ones who fucking murdered it in the first place. They don't deserve to call a good-hearted mulligan when they gutted the original team who created the game and the franchise, because no amount of do-over will undo that damage. Furthermore, EA isn't taking that big of a risk with Dead Space Remake. In fact, the game reflects EA's modern general business operating procedure, of which they are trend chasers rather than trailblazers. Like so many of the company's projects over the past 10 years follow specific market trends without taking risks. For a few examples, Battlefield, and to a lesser extent the defunct Medal of Honor, has always been playing catch-up to Call of Duty. Apex Legends gave EA a battle royale game that could compete with Fortnite. Star Wars Battlefront 2 cashed in on the avaricious loot box craze. Most of EA's recent output have been live service games, and Dead Space Remake follows Capcom's blueprint for the very successful Resident Evil remakes. So with that, EA is not doing anything too far outside of its current comfort zone. They aren't doing anything revolutionary. But still, with that said, I do hope that Dead Space Remake is successful. While I hate the idea of giving EA any form of compensation, because that honestly makes my female testicles want to shrivel up inside of me, I do want to see more games like Dead Space Remake, and not necessarily just Dead Space games, but of other single-player games and experiences as well, because so much of the AAA gaming space is oversaturated with online live services and multiplayer games, many of which are not very compelling, interesting, or fun. If anything, from third-party publishers, we need more games like Dead Space Remake or the upcoming Star Wars Jedi Survivor for that matter. We need more games of this caliber, because truly Dead Space Remake is overall fantastic. It's a terrific game. Even with EA's involvement acting like the aforementioned insult to injury, I can't deny that I'm enjoying the absolute shit out of this game. It's a blast, even despite how my cynical subconscious detests EA for having the nerve to remake this game. It is overall a good experience created at the behest of an ethically shitty publisher, and ultimately, that's how I'm approaching the Dead Space remake. I'm praising the game and its developer, but I will continue to criticize EA for their numerous transgressions, because honestly, I'm still not over what the publisher did to the franchise and those who created it, because even though Dead Space Remake deserves to be successful, EA does not deserve that same success. The art and the people behind it are commendable, but EA is not. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Dead Space remake. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of Dead Space Remake. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto this credit sequence, and $5 a month allows you to start making quick review requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.